Some fathers leave behind money, others leave wisdom. But Caleb Thorne's father left him nothing but a weathered dog collar and 30 years of unspoken words. Standing beside the fresh grave in the Montana mountains, Caleb thought he was finally free from the man who had raised him in silence and disappointment. But his father's old dog, Birch, had different plans. The aging shepherd refused to come home, refused to eat, and kept wandering back to the forest where the old man had spent his final years. When Birch disappeared completely into the deep woods, Caleb had no choice but to follow. What he found changed everything he thought he knew about his father. Hidden in the branches of an ancient oak was a hand-built treehouse, still warm with burning lanterns and filled with decades of letters written to Caleb but never sent. What was his father trying to tell him all those years? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Caleb Thorne had built a life as far from the Montana wilderness as concrete and steel could take him. His construction company in Denver specialized in high-rise buildings, glass towers that scraped the sky and blocked out any hint of forest or mountain. For 15 years, he'd surrounded himself with the ordered chaos of urban development, where problems had solutions and blueprints made sense. The irony wasn't lost on him that he'd inherited his building skills from the very man he'd spent decades avoiding. Thomas Thorne had been a craftsman in the old tradition, someone who could look at raw timber and see the bones of a barn, who measured twice and cut once, who built things to last generations. But those hands that could coax beauty from rough wood had never learned to be gentle with his son. Growing up in the shadow of Glacier National Park, Caleb had learned to read his father's moods like weather patterns. The set of Thomas's jaw meant a day of silent labor ahead. The particular way he sharpened his tools suggested disappointment brewing like a thunderstorm. And when Thomas disappeared into the workshop for hours without speaking, young Caleb knew to make himself invisible. A man's worth is in his work, Thomas had said countless times. The closest thing to philosophy he'd ever shared. Everything else is just noise. Caleb's mother, Sarah, had been the bridge between them, translating Thomas's grunts into guidance and his criticism into care. She died when Caleb was 17, a sudden heart attack that left both men stranded on opposite sides of a chasm neither knew how to cross. Without her gentle interpretation, father and son had become strangers, sharing the same roof. The day after Caleb's high school graduation, he'd left for college in Colorado and never really come back. Oh, there had been obligatory visits, Christmas dinners that stretched like dental procedures, awkward conversations about weather and work. But the easy intimacy of childhood, those Saturday mornings when Thomas would let him help with projects, teaching him to feel the grain of wood and understand the honest weight of a good hammer, all of that had died with Sarah. Thomas had retreated deeper into the mountains after her passing, selling the family home in Whitefish and buying a remote cabin that required a four-wheel drive and local knowledge just to find. He'd claimed it was for the solitude, but Caleb suspected it was to avoid the memories that lived in every corner of their old house. The cancer diagnosis had come 3 years ago. Thomas had mentioned it during one of their rare phone calls, with the same tone he might use to discuss a broken fence post. "Doctor says I've got some trouble in my lungs. Might need to slow down some." Caleb had driven up twice during the treatment, finding his father thinner each time, but still stubborn as a mountain goat. Thomas had refused to move closer to the hospital, refused help with daily tasks, and absolutely refused to discuss what would happen if the treatments didn't work. "I've got everything handled," he'd say, patting Birch's graying head. "This old dog and I understand each other just fine." Birch had been Thomas's constant companion for the past 8 years, a German shepherd mix with intelligent brown eyes and a coat that had faded from black to silver. The dog possessed an almost supernatural ability to anticipate Thomas's needs, bringing tools, herding livestock, and providing the kind of wordless companionship that suited both their temperaments. When the call came from Dr. Reynolds at the hospital, Caleb had been reviewing blueprints for a downtown hotel project. "I'm sorry, Mr. Thorne. Your father passed peacefully this morning. He asked me to tell you that Birch is waiting at the cabin." The funeral had been sparsely attended, a handful of neighbors. His father's old doctor and the pastor from the church Thomas had attended sporadically. Caleb had stood beside the pine coffin, feeling like an imposter, accepting condolences from people who seemed to know his father better than he did. Thomas was a good man, old Pete Garrison had said, his weathered hands clasping Caleb's shoulder. Quiet but good. "Did you know he built that new wing on the elementary school? Wouldn't take a penny for it, said the kids needed a proper library." Caleb hadn't known. It was another piece of a puzzle he'd never bothered to solve. At the cabin, he'd found Birch lying beside Thomas's favorite chair, the dog's entire body vibrating with a grief that seemed too large for any living thing to contain. The sound that came from the animal wasn't quite a whine, wasn't quite a howl. It was something deeper, more primal. The sound of loyalty confronting loss. The cabin itself had been surprisingly organized for a man living alone. Thomas had labeled everything, from the medicine cabinet to the workshop tools. There was a folder marked for Caleb, containing the deed to the property, insurance papers, and a brief note. "The land is yours now. Do with it what makes sense." What made sense, Caleb had decided, was to sell it all and move on. But first, he had to figure out what to do with Birch. The dog had refused to leave the mountain. Every time Caleb tried to coax him into the truck, Birch would plant his feet and look toward the deep forest with an intensity that bordered on desperation. Finally, Caleb had half-carried, half-dragged the 70-pound animal into his extended cab pickup and made the 5-hour drive to Denver. His downtown loft, all polished concrete and floor-to-ceiling windows, had been a poor substitute for mountain wilderness. Birch had spent the first day pressed against the glass, staring at the distant peaks barely visible through urban haze. He wouldn't eat the expensive dog food Caleb bought, wouldn't sleep on the orthopedic bed, wouldn't even acknowledge the rawhide bones and squeaky toys. Instead, Birch had positioned himself by the door and waited. When Caleb took him for walks along the city trails, the dog's nose would lift toward the mountains, his entire body straining northward like a compass seeking true north. On the third night, Caleb had awakened to find Birch sitting by his bedside, those intelligent brown eyes reflecting the city lights. The dog had placed his massive paw on Caleb's arm with surprising gentleness, and in that touch, Caleb had felt something he'd been avoiding since the funeral, the weight of unfinished business. The next morning, he'd called his foreman and cleared his schedule for a week. "Family matters," he'd explained, which wasn't entirely a lie. The drive back to Montana had been different this time. Birch had ridden with his head out the window, his body language transforming from grief to anticipation as they climbed into the mountains. By the time they reached the turnoff to Thomas's property, the dog was whining with excitement, but instead of heading to the cabin, Birch had jumped from the truck and disappeared into the forest the moment Caleb opened the door. No amount of calling or whistling could bring him back. It was as if the dog had simply evaporated into the pine-scented air. Caleb had spent 2 days searching, following game trails and calling until his voice gave out. The local rangers had been sympathetic but not optimistic. "Dogs know these mountains better than most people," Ranger Martinez had said. "If he wants to be found, he'll let you know." On the evening of the second day, exhausted and frustrated, Caleb had been walking back toward the cabin when he'd heard barking from deep in the forest. Not the frantic yapping of a lost animal, but the purposeful bark of a dog trying to communicate something important. Following the sound through a grove of ancient pines, Caleb had climbed higher than he'd ever explored as a child. The barking had led him to a massive oak tree, its trunk so wide that 6 men holding hands couldn't have encircled it. And there, nestled in the lower branches like something from a fairy tale, had been the treehouse, not a child's simple platform, but an elaborate structure with real walls, windows, and what appeared to be a functional chimney. Warm light glowed from inside, and a rope ladder hung down just within reach. Birch had been sitting at the base of the tree, tail wagging, looking enormously pleased with himself, standing there in the gathering dusk, looking up at what his father had built in secret. Caleb had felt the first crack in the wall he'd built around his memories. This wasn't the work of the distant, unforgiving man he remembered. This was something else entirely. Something that suggested depths he'd never imagined. The rope ladder felt solid under Caleb's hands, each rung worn smooth by years of use. As he climbed toward the warm glow emanating from the treehouse windows, he could hear Birch settling down at the base of the oak, a satisfied sigh escaping the old dog as if his mission had been accomplished. The platform at the top was larger than it had appeared from below, crafted from cedar planks that had weathered to a soft silver. The attention to detail was extraordinary. Hand-carved railings, copper gutters that would channel rainwater away from the structure, and small shutters that could be closed against mountain storms. This wasn't the work of a weekend hobbyist. This was the creation of a master craftsman at the height of his abilities. The door stood slightly ajar, revealing the golden light that had guided him through the forest. Caleb pushed it open and stepped inside, his breath catching at what he found. The interior was a single room, but every inch had been utilized with the efficiency of a ship's cabin. A comfortable bed occupied one corner, its frame built from the same weathered cedar as the exterior. A small kitchen area featured a propane stove, a sink connected to what must be a cleverly hidden water system, and cabinets lined with mason jars filled with dried goods. The opposite wall held a workshop area with hand tools hanging in precise arrangements, each one clean and oiled as if waiting for use. But it was the writing desk that drew Caleb's attention. Positioned near the largest window to catch the morning light, it was clearly the heart of the space. The desktop was covered with papers, blueprints, sketches, and what appeared to be letters written in his father's careful handwriting. Above the desk, shelves lined the wall, filled with journals and notebooks, their spines labeled with dates going back over 20 years. Caleb moved closer, his contractor's eye automatically cataloguing the craftsmanship. The desk had been built from a single piece of walnut, its surface polished to a warm glow. The drawers moved on hand-cut dovetail joints that would last centuries. Hidden underneath was a complex pulley system that could adjust the desk's height, an innovation that spoke to hours spent writing. The papers on the surface rustled in the slight breeze from the open door. Caleb picked up the topmost sheet, recognizing immediately the careful lettering his father had used for important documents. But this wasn't a building permit or a parts list. This was a letter, and it began with 2 words that hit him like a physical blow. Dear son. The date at the top was from 23 years ago, just months after Caleb had left for college. His hands trembling slightly, he read, Dear son, I know you think I don't understand why you had to leave, but I do. This place, these mountains, they can feel like a prison when you're young and the world is calling. Your mother always said you had too much of my stubbornness and too much of her dreams to be content with small horizons. I want you to know that I'm proud of you. I know I never said it. Words have never come easy to me the way they did to her. But watching you work these past years, seeing how you think through problems and find solutions, I see the man you're becoming. You have good hands and a good mind, and that combination will take you far. I'm writing this because I couldn't say it to your face without making a mess of it. You know how I am with talking about feelings and such. But I need you to know that whatever happens between us, whatever silence grows in the space where we used to be father and son, it won't be because I don't love you. It will be because I love you too much to hold you back with my shortcomings. The project I've been working on, you've probably noticed me disappearing into the forest more often. It's for you. Not for now, but for someday when you might need to remember that you come from good stock, from people who built things to last. Your mother always said that love isn't just in the words we speak, but in the work we do for each other when no one's watching. I hope you find what you're looking for out there in the world. And I hope someday you'll come home and see what I've been building, The letter wasn't signed, just ended abruptly as if Thomas had run out of courage or words or both. Caleb's vision blurred as he set it down, his chest tight with emotions he'd kept buried for decades. He looked around the treehouse with new eyes. Every detail spoke of patient planning and careful consideration. The bed was built to accommodate his height, not his father's shorter frame. The kitchen was stocked with foods he'd enjoyed as a teenager. Good coffee, honey from local hives, even a jar of the huckleberry jam his mother used to make. The workshop tools included a complete set of woodworking chisels, the expensive German steel ones he'd admired as a boy, but that Thomas had said were too good for learning hands. This wasn't just a retreat or a hobby project. This was a gift, 20 years in the making. Caleb moved to the shelves above the desk, pulling down one of the journals. It was labeled Year 1 and filled with his father's precise handwriting. The entries weren't daily diary musings, but detailed documentation of the treehouse construction, complete with sketches and problem-solving notes. But scattered throughout were observations that had nothing to do with building. Caleb called today. "Sounds tired. Working too many hours, I think. Wish I knew how to tell him that success isn't worth your health." Saw an article about his company in the Denver paper. Building downtown office complex. The picture shows good work, clean lines, solid foundation. He learned well. Christmas card arrived. He looks happy in the photo, but something in his eyes reminds me of myself at that age. Hope he finds more joy than I did. Page after page revealed a father who had been paying attention from a distance, who had cared deeply, but had never found the words to bridge the gap between them. The entries chronicled not just the construction of the treehouse, but Thomas's own evolution from the rigid, silent man Caleb remembered to someone capable of reflection and regret. In the journal labeled Year 15, Caleb found an entry that made his knees weak. Doctor confirmed what I already knew. 2 years, maybe 3 if I'm lucky. Time to finish what I started. The treehouse is ready, but the letters aren't. How do you summarize a lifetime of things you should have said? How do you apologize for being the father you were instead of the father you should have been? Maybe the structure itself will speak louder than my words ever could. Maybe when he sees what I built for him, he'll understand that love doesn't always look the way we expect it to. Caleb sank into the chair at the writing desk, surrounded by evidence of a devotion he'd never suspected. Birch's behavior suddenly made perfect sense. The dog hadn't been grieving randomly. He'd been trying to complete his master's final mission, to bring Caleb to this place where 20 years of unspoken love waited to be discovered. Outside, night had fully fallen, but the treehouse remained warm and bright. Propane lanterns cast a golden glow that made the space feel alive, as if Thomas might walk through the door at any moment with an armload of firewood and a shy smile. For the first time since the funeral, Caleb allowed himself to cry, not just for his father's death, but for all the years they'd lost to pride and misunderstanding. The tears fell onto the walnut desktop, onto letters that should have been sent and conversations that should have been had. But as the grief washed over him, something else emerged, a profound sense of gratitude. His father had given him something more valuable than money or property. He'd given him proof that love could exist in silence, that devotion could be expressed through patient work, and that it was never too late to begin understanding each other. The treehouse wasn't just a structure. It was Thomas Thorne's autobiography, written in wood and stone, and the careful accumulation of years. And Caleb, for the first time in his adult life, was finally ready to read it. Caleb spent that first night in the treehouse, unable to bring himself to leave. He'd found blankets in a cedar chest, soft wool that smelled faintly of lavender, the way his mother used to scent their linens. The bed fit him perfectly, and for the first time in years, he slept without the ambient noise of the city to lull him into unconsciousness. He woke to Birch's gentle whining from below and the sound of morning birds greeting the dawn. Sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like tiny spirits in the golden air. The treehouse felt different in daylight, less mysterious, more welcoming, as if it had been waiting patiently for him to accept its invitation. After climbing down to let Birch relieve himself, Caleb returned to explore more thoroughly. In the kitchen cabinets, he discovered not just provisions, but his father's careful planning. Each jar was labeled with dates, and many contained foods that wouldn't have been Thomas's preference. Dark roast coffee instead of the light blend his father had always drunk, honey instead of sugar, even a bottle of the expensive vanilla extract Caleb's mother had used for special occasion baking. The workshop area revealed an artifact that stopped him cold, a wooden music box. Half finished, its mechanism exposed like the workings of a delicate clock. The wood was cherry, carved with intricate detail that suggested countless hours of patient work. Inside the mechanism, he recognized the melody, Danny Boy, the song his mother used to hum while cooking dinner. Beside the music box lay detailed plans in his father's handwriting, showing different design iterations and noting which woods would produce the best resonance. At the bottom of the page, in smaller script, Thomas had written, "For Sarah's anniversary." Something beautiful to remember, beautiful things. But his mother had died 12 years ago. This wasn't a gift for her. It was Thomas's way of keeping her memory alive, of working through grief with his hands the same way other men might work through it with words or drink. Caleb picked up the music box carefully, his fingers tracing the partially carved roses along its edge. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each petal distinct, each leaf catching light differently. This was the work of a man who had found poetry in precision, who had discovered that love could be expressed through the patient accumulation of perfect details. A notebook beside the music box contained sketches of other projects. A rocking chair with Caleb's initials carved into the headrest, a dining table designed to seat 8 for grandchildren someday, the margin note read, and something that made Caleb's breath catch, plans for renovating the old family home in Whitefish. The renovation drawings showed the house as it could be, not as it had been. The cramped kitchen opened into a spacious area where multiple generations could gather. The small bedrooms were reconfigured to create a master suite and space for visiting family. Most telling were the notes scattered throughout. Better lighting for Sarah's sewing corner, and Caleb always wanted a workshop like mine, build one off the garage. These weren't just architectural fantasies. They were hopes made tangible, dreams rendered in careful measurements and detailed specifications. Thomas had been planning a future that included reconciliation, had been designing spaces for the family reunion he'd never had the courage to initiate. The weight of discovery was becoming overwhelming. Each artifact revealed another layer of the man Caleb thought he'd known, stripping away assumptions like old paint to reveal something entirely different underneath. His phone rang, jolting him back to the present world beyond the treehouse. "Caleb, where the hell are you?" It was Marcus, his business partner and project manager. "The Hillcrest clients are asking about the timeline changes, and I can't reach you. I'm in Montana. Family stuff." Caleb stepped outside onto the platform, looking down at Birch, who was exploring the base of the oak with the methodical thoroughness of a bloodhound. "Montana? I thought you handled all that when your dad died. We've got 3 projects hitting critical phases next week." The conversation felt surreal, like trying to discuss quantum physics while standing in a meadow. How could he explain that his entire understanding of his past was being rewritten, that the foundation of his adult identity was proving to be built on shifting ground? "I need more time, Marcus. Can you handle things for another week?" "A week? Caleb, the Henderson project alone, you're capable of managing it. You've been doing most of the real work anyway." The words came out harsher than intended, but they contained a truth he'd been avoiding. Somewhere along the way, his passion for building had become mere competence. His love of creating something lasting had devolved into simply completing contracts on time and under budget. After hanging up, Caleb climbed back into the treehouse and returned to the journals. The Year 5 volume contained an entry that felt like his father speaking directly to him across time. Watched a documentary about cathedral builders tonight. Took generations to complete some of those structures. Men would start carving stones, knowing they'd never see the finished building. But they'd work with perfect precision anyway, because they understood they were part of something larger than themselves. Made me think about this treehouse project. Not sure I'll live to see Caleb understand what I'm trying to build here. But that doesn't change the importance of getting every detail right. The entry continued. Sarah used to say that love is a long-term project, not a single gesture. She was right about that, like she was right about most things. This treehouse isn't about the building itself. It's about demonstrating that some forms of devotion can only be expressed through sustained effort over time. Hope he gets that when he finally finds this place. Caleb set the journal down, his hands shaking slightly. His father had understood something about love and legacy that Caleb was only beginning to grasp. The treehouse wasn't just shelter or memorial. It was proof that caring could be expressed through persistence, that the most profound gifts required not grand gestures, but daily commitment to an invisible future. Below, Birch had found something interesting near the base of the tree. The old dog was pawing at a section of ground, whining softly. Caleb climbed down to investigate and discovered what appeared to be a deliberately placed stone, flat and smooth, with something carved into its surface, brushing away the accumulated pine needles and dirt. He revealed an inscription in his father's careful lettering, the first board. May 15th, 2003. A man's work outlasts his words. For my son, who taught me what building really means. May 15th, Caleb's graduation day from college. The day he'd thought his father was simply attending out of obligation, sitting silent in the back row during the ceremony, offering only a brief handshake afterward. But Thomas had driven straight home and begun the most important project of his life. The realization hit Caleb like cold mountain air. His father hadn't been absent or uncaring. He'd been overwhelmed by emotions he couldn't express, channeling his pride and hope into the only language he truly understood, the patient craft of building something that would endure. 3 days passed in the treehouse, and Caleb found himself falling into a rhythm he hadn't experienced since childhood. He woke with the sun, made coffee using his father's precise measurements, and spent the morning hours reading through the journals chronologically. Each volume revealed another layer of Thomas's evolution, from the rigid, silent man of Caleb's memory to someone capable of deep reflection and carefully expressed tenderness. The artifact that occupied most of his 4th day was a collection of newspaper clippings, meticulously preserved in a leather-bound scrapbook. Every article about Caleb's construction company had been carefully cut out and mounted, from the small notice in the business section when he'd first gotten his contractor's license to the full-page feature in Colorado Business Magazine 3 years. Thomas had been following his career from afar, celebrating victories Caleb had never thought to share, and worrying over challenges his father had no way to help with. Margin notes in his father's handwriting revealed the depth of his attention. Good choice on the steel frame. Wood would have warped in that climate, and smart to underbid the foundation work to get the contract. Sometimes you take a loss to build a reputation, but the most revealing annotations were the personal ones. Next to a photo of Caleb at a construction site, Thomas had written, "He's gotten thin, working too hard, just like I did at that age. Hope he learns to take better care of himself than I did." Below a quote from Caleb about sustainable building practices. His mother would be proud. He's thinking about legacy, not just profit. The scrapbook contained other surprises, articles about building techniques Thomas thought Caleb might find interesting, reviews of tools he'd considered recommending, even vacation brochures for places like Ireland and Scotland, where traditional stone building was still practiced. In the margins of a travel article about Irish cottages, Thomas had written, "Caleb always loved those stories Sarah read him about the old country. Maybe someday he'll want to see where his grandfather learned to work with stone." These weren't the observations of a distant father, but the careful documentation of a man who had never stopped paying attention, who had never stopped hoping for connection. The silence between them hadn't been indifference. It had been Thomas's way of loving without imposing, of caring without demanding reciprocation. Caleb's phone buzzed with another call from Marcus, but he let it go to voicemail. His business partner's increasingly frantic messages painted a picture of controlled chaos, missed deadlines, confused clients, and projects teetering on the edge of disaster. But for the first time in years, Caleb couldn't summon the urgency that had once driven him. The problems that had seemed monumentally important a week ago felt distant and manageable from the treehouse. He was beginning to understand something his father had known intuitively. There was a difference between building for profit and building for purpose. The treehouse hadn't been constructed to meet deadlines or satisfy clients. It had been built as an act of faith, a bridge across time designed to connect two men who had never learned to speak the same language. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor. Caleb heard voices below and looked down to see an elderly woman standing beside Birch, who was wagging his tail with enthusiasm. She was perhaps 70, with silver hair braided down her back and the weathered hands of someone who had spent a lifetime working outdoors. "You must be Caleb," she called up. "I'm Elena Santos. I live about 2 miles down the mountain. Your father mentioned you might show up here eventually." Caleb climbed down to meet her, noting that she moved with the easy confidence of someone comfortable in the wilderness. She carried a canvas bag that smelled of fresh bread and something that might have been soup. "Thomas asked me to keep an eye on this place," she continued, scratching Birch behind the ears. "Make sure the propane stayed filled. The water system didn't freeze in winter." He was very specific about maintaining everything exactly as he left it. "You knew about the treehouse?" Elena smiled, and in that expression, Caleb saw something he'd been missing in his father's journals, the perspective of someone who had known Thomas in his later years, who had seen the man he'd become, rather than the man he'd been. "Your father and I became friends after your mother passed. We both understood what it meant to lose someone who had been the center of your world. He talked about you constantly, your projects, your success, his regrets about the distance between you." She gestured toward the treehouse. This was his way of building a conversation he didn't know how to start. "Every time I saw him working up here, he'd tell me about some new detail he'd added, some consideration for your comfort or convenience. Caleb always liked good coffee," he'd say, or "Caleb needs proper light for reading. He gets that from his mother." Elena opened her bag and pulled out a thermos and wrapped bundle. "He also asked me to give you this when you finally came." She handed him an envelope, thick with papers addressed in Thomas's careful script, "For Caleb, when he's ready to understand." Inside were architectural drawings, but not for the treehouse. These were plans for a workshop, designed to be built adjacent to the old family cabin. The drawings showed a spacious area with proper ventilation, professional-grade tool storage, and workbenches designed for both wood and stonework. But what caught Caleb's attention were the notes scattered throughout, large enough for 2 people to work comfortably, and "extra space for teaching, grandson's workshop." At the bottom of the plans, Thomas had written a longer note. "Son, if you're reading this, it means Birch did his job and brought you here. This workshop is my offer, not an obligation but an invitation. I know you've built a good life in the city, and I'm proud of what you've accomplished. But if you ever want to come home, if you ever want to work with your hands the way we used to when you were young, there's a place here waiting for you. We could build things together again if you're willing. We could try to be the father and son we never quite managed to be before." Elena watched as Caleb absorbed the implications. "He wasn't trying to pull you away from your life," she said gently. "He was offering you another option. A place to come when the city gets too loud, when building for profit stops feeding your soul." Caleb looked up at the treehouse, then back at the workshop plans, then at Birch, who was watching him with the patient intelligence of a creature who understood more than anyone gave him credit for. The dog had brought him here not just to discover the treehouse, but to find a path forward that honored both the life he'd built and the heritage he'd inherited. For the first time since arriving, Caleb felt something shift inside him, not the collapse of his old life, but the expansion of possibilities he'd never considered. Elena's visit had opened a door that Caleb hadn't known existed. Over the following days, she became a regular presence, arriving each morning with coffee and stories about Thomas's final years that painted a picture of a man Caleb had never known existed. Your father wasn't the hermit everyone thought he was, she explained. One morning as they sat on the treehouse platform, watching Birch chase squirrels through the underbrush. He helped half the families in this valley with their building projects. Never took payment, just showed up when someone needed a barn raised or a roof repaired. She pulled out a worn photograph from her jacket pocket. It showed Thomas surrounded by a group of people Caleb didn't recognize. Families with children, elderly couples, young men with work-hardened hands. Everyone was smiling, and Thomas looked relaxed in a way Caleb had never seen. That was the Martinez barn raising 2 summers ago. Their old one burned down in a lightning strike, and they couldn't afford to hire contractors. Your father organized the whole community effort, designed the new structure, and worked 14-hour days until it was finished. Caleb studied his father's face in the photograph. This wasn't the stern, distant man of his childhood memories. This Thomas looked content, purposeful, surrounded by people who clearly respected and cared for him. He taught my grandson carpentry, Elena continued. Miguel was heading down a bad path after high school, drinking too much, no direction. Thomas took him under his wing, taught him to see the dignity in working with his hands. Miguel's a master carpenter now, has his own business in Kalispell. Each story revealed another facet of his father's hidden life, another relationship Caleb had known nothing about. But the most significant artifact Elena shared was a leather journal different from all the others, one marked letters written rather than letters to write. He started this 5 years ago, she explained, handing him the journal. After the cancer diagnosis, he said he needed to practice saying the things he'd never been able to say out loud. The journal contained drafts of letters Thomas had actually sent to old friends, to distant relatives, to people he'd wronged or neglected over the years. Each letter was a small masterpiece of reconciliation, carefully crafted to heal old wounds or express long overdue gratitude. One letter was addressed to his late wife's sister in Oregon. Dear Margaret, I know we haven't spoken since Sarah's funeral, and I know that's my fault. I was so lost in my grief that I couldn't see yours, couldn't understand that you needed to talk about her as much as I needed silence. I'm writing now to say I'm sorry and to ask if you might share some of your memories of Sarah with me. I'm trying to remember the joy instead of just the loss, and you knew her in ways I never did. The letter was marked Sent, March 2021, with a note, Margaret called. We talked for 3 hours. She's coming to visit this summer. Another letter was to his old foreman from the lumber mill where he'd worked in his 20s. Bill, I heard through the grapevine that you're retiring next month. I wanted to write and tell you that the lessons you taught me about precision and taking pride in your work shaped everything I did afterward. You were harder on me than anyone, but you made me better. I never thanked you properly for that. I hope retirement treats you well. Page after page revealed a man actively working to repair relationships, to acknowledge debts of gratitude, to clean up the emotional debris of a lifetime. This wasn't the silent, emotionally distant father Caleb remembered, but someone who had learned, perhaps too late, the importance of saying difficult things out loud. The most painful entry was a draft of a letter to Caleb himself, dated just 6 months before Thomas's death. Dear son, I've written this letter 100 times in my head and on paper, but I never seem to find the courage to send it. I know I failed you as a father in ways that matter. I was so afraid of showing weakness that I forgot to show love. I was so focused on teaching you to be strong that I never learned to be gentle. Your mother always said that men of my generation were trained to believe that caring too much made you soft, but I think we got it backward. It takes more strength to be vulnerable than it does to be silent. I'm learning that now, but I'm afraid it's too late to matter. I'm dying, Caleb. The doctors give me months, not years. I'm not telling you this to make you feel guilty for staying away. I understand why you did. I'm telling you because I want you to know that my greatest regret isn't the cancer or the pain or even leaving this world. My greatest regret is that I never learned how to tell you how proud I am of the man you became. The treehouse is my apology. It's also my hope. If you ever find it, if you ever sit in the space I built thinking about you every day for 20 years, maybe you'll understand that love doesn't always look the way we expect it to. Maybe you'll forgive an old man who loved you more than he knew how to show. The letter was marked, "Draft never sent," with a note in different ink. Too late for words. Let the work speak for itself. Caleb had to set the journal down, his vision blurring with tears he'd been fighting for days. Elena placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. He was practicing, she said softly, learning how to be the man he wished he'd been all along. The treehouse wasn't just a gift to you. It was part of his own healing. That afternoon, alone in the treehouse, Caleb found himself examining everything with new understanding. Each carefully crafted detail wasn't just evidence of his father's skill, but proof of his transformation. The man who had built this place had been different from the father Caleb remembered, more patient, more thoughtful, more capable of expressing love through sustained effort rather than grand gestures. He opened his laptop for the first time in days and found dozens of emails from Marcus, each more urgent than the last. The Henderson project was behind schedule. The Hillcrest clients were threatening to find another contractor. 2 potential new jobs were slipping away because Caleb wasn't available to bid on them. 6 months ago, any one of these problems would have sent him into crisis mode. Now, reading them from the treehouse his father had built, they seemed manageable, even insignificant. The work would wait. The clients would understand or they wouldn't. The money would come or it wouldn't. What mattered was this moment, this place, this opportunity to finally understand the man who had raised him and the legacy he'd inherited. For the first time in his adult life, Caleb was more interested in building something meaningful than building something profitable. A week into his stay at the treehouse, Caleb made a discovery that changed everything he thought he understood about his childhood. Hidden behind a false panel in the writing desk, so expertly concealed that he found it only by accident when cleaning, was a collection of items that took his breath away. The artifact that shook him most was a small wooden box containing every letter he had ever sent his father. Birthday cards with his childish handwriting, postcards from college trips, even a few angry letters from his early 20s when their relationship had been at its worst. Each piece of correspondence had been carefully preserved, some showing wear patterns that suggested frequent handling. But more surprising were his father's responses. Dozens of letters Thomas had written back, but never sent. They were filed chronologically, creating a one-sided conversation that spanned decades. Reading them was like discovering a parallel universe where he and his father had maintained the relationship Caleb had always wished for in response to a college letter where Caleb had complained about struggling with calculus. Thomas had written, "Mathematics was never my strong suit either. I nearly failed algebra in high school, but your grandfather sat with me every night until I understood it. He said that sometimes the things that come hardest teach us the most about persistence. You'll figure it out. You have your mother's mind for problems and my stubbornness when something matters." To a postcard Caleb had sent from a spring break trip to Mexico, Thomas had responded, "Glad you're seeing the world beyond these mountains. Your mother always wanted to travel more than we could afford. She would have loved hearing about the architecture you described. When you come home, I'd like to hear more about how they build in different climates. Might learn something useful, even to one of Caleb's angry letters, written when he was 25, and frustrated by what he perceived as his father's lack of interest in his life. Thomas had crafted a response. "You're right to be angry with me. I know I seem distant, and I know that hurts you. The truth is, I'm afraid of saying the wrong thing, of driving you further away with my clumsy attempts at conversation. I was raised by a man who believed silence was safer than speech, and I've never learned different. But your anger tells me you still care what I think, and that gives me hope. The letters revealed a Thomas who was thoughtful, regretful, and desperately wanting connection, but paralyzed by fear of making their relationship worse through awkward attempts at communication. They showed a man who had been paying careful attention to every detail of Caleb's life, who had been proud and worried and hopeful in equal measure. Elena found him that afternoon sitting on the treehouse floor, surrounded by scattered letters, tears streaming down his face. The letters he never sent, she said, recognizing the artifacts immediately. He showed them to me once, near the end. Said they were his greatest failure and his greatest truth. Why didn't he send them? Caleb's voice was raw with emotion. Why didn't he just mail them? We could have had this conversation 20 years ago. Elena settled beside him, her presence a comfort in his turmoil. Because he was terrified of your rejection. He'd convinced himself that silence was better than the risk of driving you away completely. She picked up one of the letters, scanning its contents with the familiarity of someone who had heard these stories before. Your father grew up with a man who showed affection through criticism and love through demands for improvement. It took him years to understand that you needed different things from him, but he figured it out eventually, Caleb said, gesturing to the letters. These show he understood what I needed to hear. Understanding and doing are different things, Eleanor replied gently. Thomas spent his whole life believing that his love wasn't enough, that anything he said would sound clumsy compared to what your mother could have said. He thought the treehouse could speak for him in ways his voice never could. That evening, alone again in the treehouse, Caleb called Marcus for the first time in days. His business partner's relief was audible. Thank God you're answering. I've been handling things, but we need decisions only you can make. The Henderson timeline is shot, and they're talking about penalty clauses. Plus, we've got that new shopping center bid due Monday, and I can't submit it without your signature on the cost estimates. Caleb listened to the familiar litany of urgent problems, but for the first time, he found himself thinking about them differently. Marcus, what if we didn't take every job that came our way? What do you mean? I mean, what if we were more selective? What if we only worked on projects we actually cared about, things we could be proud of 20 years from now? There was a long pause. Caleb, are you feeling okay? That's not how business works. You take the jobs that pay the bills, and if you're lucky, some of them are interesting too. Maybe that's the problem, Caleb said, looking around the treehouse that had been built with no thought of profit or deadline, only the patient accumulation of care and attention. Maybe we've been thinking about this wrong. After the call, he sat on the platform watching the sun set through the pine trees. Birch settled contentedly at his feet. The old dog had been growing stronger during their time in the mountains, his coat shinier, his movements more confident. Being here had restored something in both of them. Caleb opened his laptop and began typing, not an email to Marcus about business crises, but a letter to his father. It felt strange writing to a dead man, but after reading Thomas's unsent correspondence, it also felt necessary. Dad, I found your letters today, all of them. I wish you had sent them, but I understand why you didn't. We were both afraid of the same thing, saying the wrong words and making the distance between us even greater. I need you to know that I understand now what you were trying to build here. This isn't just a tree house. It's a conversation we were both too scared to have while you were alive. It's an apology and an invitation and a love letter all built from wood and time and the kind of patience I never learned to have. I'm sorry I stayed away so long. I'm sorry I didn't try harder to understand the man you were instead of being angry about the man I thought you should be. I'm sorry it took finding this place to realize that love doesn't always sound like words. I don't know what happens next, but I know I can't go back to Denver and pretend this never happened. You've given me something more valuable than money or property. You've given me a new way of thinking about what it means to build something that matters. He wrote until the moon was high and the propane lanterns cast dancing shadows on the treehouse walls. For the first time since childhood, he felt truly connected to his father. linked across time by understanding rather than separated by silence. Outside, an owl called through the darkness, and Birch lifted his head briefly before settling back into sleep. The mountain night was profound in its peace, and Caleb finally understood why his father had chosen to spend his final years here, surrounded by the eternal patience of trees and stones and creatures who measured time differently than the urgent world below. On his 10th day at the treehouse, Caleb discovered something that recontextualized everything he thought he understood about his father's final years. While exploring the workshop area more thoroughly, he noticed that one section of the floor sounded different when walked on, hollow, as if there was space beneath. Further investigation revealed a carefully hidden trapdoor, secured with a simple latch that had been concealed by sawdust and wood shavings. When Caleb lifted the panel, he found a ladder leading down to what appeared to be a root cellar, carved into the earth beneath the massive oak. The underground chamber took his breath away. It was larger than the treehouse above, carved from solid rock and earth, with the same precision Thomas brought to all his work. But this wasn't a simple storage space. It was a workshop unlike anything Caleb had ever imagined. The artifact that dominated the space was a massive wooden sculpture, nearly 12 feet tall and carved from a single piece of cedar. It depicted a tree of life, its branches spreading wide to support dozens of smaller figures, men, women, and children engaged in various activities. Some were building, others teaching, some were reading or playing. At the base of the tree, 2 figures sat side by side, one with his hand on the other's shoulder. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, each figure distinct and detailed, each face expressing a different emotion. But what made Caleb's knees weak was the realization that he recognized many of the faces. There was Elena, captured in the act of tending a garden. There was Miguel, Elena's grandson, working with tiny wooden tools. There were the families from the barn-raising photograph, the children playing while adults worked together, and there, near the top of the tree, was a figure that looked unmistakably like Caleb himself, but not as he was now. This version was younger, maybe 10 years old, and he was working alongside a man who could only be Thomas. Both figures were smiling, their hands joined in holding a small wooden bird they had carved together. Scattered around the base of the sculpture were notebooks filled with sketches and notes. The project had taken Thomas 5 years to complete, working in secret during the long winter months when the mountain passes were snowed in. Each figure had been planned meticulously, with multiple drawings showing different poses and expressions before Thomas settled on the final design. But the most shocking discovery was a letter pinned to the workbench, addressed not to Caleb, but to the Whitefish Historical Society. To whom it may concern, I'm donating this sculpture to the town with the understanding that it will be displayed in the new community center. The piece is titled Legacy and represents my attempt to capture the connections that bind a community together across generations. The sculpture is my gift to the people who gave me a second chance at family when my own seemed beyond repair. It is also my hope that future generations will understand that we are all part of something larger than ourselves, that our individual efforts matter most when they contribute to the common good. I ask only that this piece be displayed where children can see it, so they might understand that every adult in their community was once a child with dreams, and that every child they know will someday be responsible for carrying those dreams forward. The letter was dated 3 months before Thomas's death and marked ready for delivery. Below it was a detailed plan for transporting the sculpture, complete with the measurements and equipment needed to move something that large through the forest. Caleb sank onto a wooden stool, overwhelmed by the implications. His father hadn't just been building a treehouse and workshop for reconciliation. He'd been creating a masterpiece intended for public display. This wasn't the work of a hermit or a recluse, but of an artist who understood his place in the larger community and wanted to leave something beautiful behind. Elena's voice from above startled him. "Caleb, are you down there? I brought lunch." When she climbed down and saw the sculpture, her reaction was immediate and emotional. Tears flowed freely as she moved around the carved tree, pointing out details and people she recognized. "He worked on this for years," she whispered. "He'd come up here after helping with community projects, translating what he'd seen into wood. He said he wanted to create something that showed how individual lives connect to make something stronger. Did you know he planned to donate it?" Elena nodded. "He asked me to help with the delivery after he was gone, but then he got sicker, faster than expected. I thought maybe the plan had been abandoned." She pointed to the two figures at the base of the tree, Thomas and Caleb working together. "He carved that section last, just 2 months before he died. He said it represented hope rather than memory, what could still be instead of what had been lost." Caleb studied his own carved face, 10 years old and smiling, working in harmony with his father. It was a vision of the relationship they'd never had, but that Thomas had never stopped believing might be possible. "There's something else you need to see," Elena said, producing a manila envelope from her jacket. "Thomas gave this to me before he died, with instructions to show it to you only if you found the sculpture." Inside were architectural drawings for a community workshop, designed to be built adjacent to the new town community center. The plans showed a space large enough for multiple people to work simultaneously, with separate areas for woodworking, metalworking, and stone carving. But what caught Caleb's attention were the teaching stations, spaces specifically designed for passing skills from one generation to the next. At the bottom of the plans, Thomas had written, "A place where knowledge doesn't die with the person who holds it, where children can learn from their elders and carry forward what matters, where the community can build together instead of separately." Attached to the plans was a legal document establishing a trust fund to pay for the workshop's construction and ongoing maintenance. Thomas had quietly sold timber rights on portions of his land, accumulating enough money to fund the project in perpetuity. "He wanted you to oversee the construction," Elena explained. "Not as an obligation, but as an invitation to come home and be part of something larger than yourself." Caleb looked around the underground chamber, then back at the sculpture that represented his father's final artistic statement. Thomas hadn't just been planning reconciliation with his son, he'd been orchestrating a way for both of them to reconnect with their community, to be part of building something that would outlast their individual lives. The plan was breathtaking in its scope and generosity. Thomas had found a way to transform his regret about their relationship into something that could benefit generations of families. The community workshop would be his legacy, but it would also be Caleb's opportunity to finally understand what his father had meant about building things that mattered. Outside, Birch was barking insistently, as if he knew that Caleb had finally discovered the heart of Thomas's message. The old dog had guided him to the treehouse, but the treehouse had been just the beginning, an invitation to discover the larger vision his father had been working toward. Standing in the carved chamber beneath the ancient oak, surrounded by evidence of his father's artistic genius and community spirit, Caleb realized that everything he'd thought he knew about Thomas Thorne had been wrong. His father hadn't been a distant, uncaring man. He'd been a visionary who understood that the most important buildings aren't the ones that make money, but the ones that bring people together. The discovery of the sculpture and community workshop plans forced Caleb to confront a decision he'd been avoiding since arriving at the treehouse. His father had left him more than just property and memories. He'd left him a mission that would require choosing between the life he'd built and the legacy he'd inherited. That evening, Elena helped him understand the full scope of what Thomas had envisioned. Sitting in the treehouse as the sun set through the pine trees, she spread out additional documents that revealed the careful planning behind the community workshop project. "Your father didn't just want to build a building," she explained. "He wanted to create a place where the old skills wouldn't die out, where young people could learn from their elders. He'd seen too many families lose the knowledge that had sustained them for generations, the artifact that crystallized Thomas's vision was a curriculum he'd developed over his final 2 years. Detailed lesson plans for teaching traditional building skills, complete with progressive skill levels and safety protocols. It wasn't the casual sharing of hobby knowledge, but a comprehensive educational program designed to preserve and pass forward generations of accumulated wisdom. "Look at this," Eleanor said, pointing to a section labeled Grandfather Teaching Moments. Thomas had documented specific techniques passed down through his own family, from his grandfather's methods for selecting timber to his father's approaches to understanding how wood moved with weather and time. He realized that when he died, all this knowledge would die with him unless he found a way to share it systematically. The workshop wasn't just about having a place to work. It was about creating an institution that could outlast any individual person. Caleb studied the curriculum, recognizing in its careful structure the same methodical approach his father had brought to every project. This wasn't a sentimental dream, but a practical plan for cultural preservation, designed with the precision of an engineer and the heart of someone who understood what the world would lose if these skills disappeared. His phone rang, breaking the mountain silence. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and Caleb felt the familiar knot of anxiety that had once defined his relationship with work. "Caleb, we've got a serious problem. The Henderson project is completely derailed, and they're threatening to sue for breach of contract. I need you back here immediately. We're talking about potentially losing the business if we can't salvage this." The urgency in Marcus's voice would have sent him into crisis mode 2 weeks ago. Now sitting in the treehouse his father had built with infinite patience, Caleb found himself thinking about different kinds of problems and different kinds of solutions. "What exactly went wrong?" he asked, though part of him already knew the answer. They'd been cutting corners, pushing timelines, prioritizing speed over quality in ways that would have made Thomas shake his head in disappointment. The foundation work was rushed because we were behind schedule, and now there are settling issues. The structural engineers say we need to rebuild from the ground up. It's going to cost us everything we've made on the project and then some. Caleb closed his eyes, remembering his father's voice from childhood. Measure twice, cut once. Do it right the first time, because doing it wrong costs more than money. It costs your reputation. "I'll be there tomorrow," he said finally. "But Marcus, after we fix this, we need to have a serious conversation about how we do business." After hanging up, he sat in silence while Eleanor watched him process the competing demands on his life. Below them, Birch was contentedly chewing on a stick, apparently unconcerned about the human complications unfolding above. "You're going back," Elena said. "It wasn't a question, I have to. I have obligations, people depending on me. And after you fix this crisis, will there be another one? And another after that?" Elena's questions echoed thoughts Caleb had been avoiding. The pattern was clear. Crisis, followed by temporary resolution, followed by the next crisis. An endless cycle that left no room for the kind of patient, thoughtful work his father had done. "Your father faced the same choice," Elena continued. "After your mother died, he could have thrown himself into work, used busyness to avoid dealing with his grief. Instead, he chose to slow down, to think about what really mattered." She gestured toward the workshop plans spread between them. "This project represents 2 years of careful thought about legacy, about what he wanted to leave behind. How long has it been since you've had 2 years to think about anything besides the next deadline?" That night, Caleb climbed down to the underground chamber and spent hours studying the sculpture by lantern light. Each carved figure told a story of community connection, of individual skills contributing to collective strength. His father had understood something about the relationship between personal fulfillment and community contribution that Caleb was only beginning to grasp. The next morning brought another surprise visitor. Miguel Santos, Elena's grandson, arrived carrying a toolbox and wearing work clothes stained with fresh sawdust. "Grandmother told me you'd found the workshop plans," he said by way of introduction. "I wanted to show you something your father left for you." Miguel was perhaps 30, with the calloused hands and easy confidence of someone comfortable with physical work. He moved through the forest with the same unhurried competence Caleb remembered from watching his father work. Thomas taught me everything I know about traditional joinery, Miguel continued as they walked toward the old cabin site. But more than that, he taught me to think about why I was building something, not just how to build it. Near the cabin, Miguel stopped at what appeared to be a pile of lumber covered with tarps. When he pulled the coverings away, Caleb saw a collection of perfectly milled beams, posts, and planks, enough material to frame a substantial building. "Your father cut and seasoned this timber over 3 years," Miguel explained. "Every piece is marked with where it should go in the workshop construction. He said the wood needed time to settle into itself before it could hold something important." The artifact that caught Caleb's attention was a leather-bound journal lying on top of the lumber pile. Inside, Thomas had documented the source of each piece of wood, which tree it came from, when it was cut, how it had been seasoned. But more than that, he'd written about why each piece had been chosen for its specific purpose. Corner post, northeast corner, cut from the oak that grew beside the original homestead. This tree watched over 4 generations of my family. When it fell in the storm of 2019, I knew it wanted to keep protecting something important. Main beam, workshop entrance. Pine from the ridge where Caleb and I used to hunt for Christmas trees. Strong wood that grew slowly in harsh conditions. Like my son, it became tougher because of the challenges it faced. Every piece of lumber had been selected not just for its structural properties, but for its emotional significance. Thomas had been building the workshop not just with wood, but with memory, creating a structure that would carry forward the history of the place and the people who had shaped it. He spent the last month of his life finishing the plans and preparing everything for construction, Miguel said. He told me that if you decided to build the workshop, you shouldn't have to start from nothing. The foundation of good work is preparation. Standing among the carefully prepared materials, Caleb felt the weight of his father's expectations and his own sense of obligation pulling him in different directions. Thomas had done everything possible to make the workshop project feasible, but he'd also been careful not to make it mandatory. The choice remained Caleb's to make. But his father had removed every practical obstacle except one: the courage to change course. To choose building something meaningful over building something profitable. His phone buzzed with another urgent message from Marcus, and Caleb realized he was standing at the exact crossroads his father had faced after his mother's death. He could return to Denver, solve the current crisis, and continue the familiar pattern of reactive problem-solving. Or he could honor the careful preparation Thomas had done and try to build something that would outlast his own lifetime. For the first time since discovering the treehouse, Caleb understood that his father's greatest gift wasn't the buildings he'd constructed, but the choice he'd preserved, the option to step off the treadmill of urgent demands and invest in something that mattered beyond the next quarterly report. Caleb's return to Denver felt like stepping into someone else's life. The city air tasted thin after 2 weeks of mountain atmosphere, and the constant noise of traffic and construction seemed overwhelming after the profound quiet of the forest. His downtown loft, once a symbol of his success, now felt like an expensive cage. The Henderson Project crisis was worse than Marcus had described. Standing in the conference room with lawyers, insurance adjusters, and angry clients, Caleb found himself thinking about his father's approach to problems. Methodical, patient, focused on long-term solutions rather than quick fixes. "The foundation's settling is catastrophic," the structural engineer explained, pointing to measurements that showed the building shifting beyond acceptable tolerances. "We're looking at complete demolition and reconstruction of the lower 3 floors. The numbers were staggering, over $2 million in additional costs, 8 months of delays, and potential lawsuits that could destroy the company's reputation." Marcus sat pale and silent, occasionally shooting Caleb desperate looks that said everything about how far beyond his expertise the situation had become. But as Caleb studied the engineering reports, he began to see patterns that his mountain sojourn had trained him to notice. The problems weren't random failures. They were the predictable result of systemic corner cutting, of prioritizing speed over fundamental soundness. "We rushed the soil compaction because we were behind schedule," he said to the room. "We used cheaper rebar than specified because it would arrive faster. We poured concrete in weather conditions we knew were marginal because waiting would have meant missing our deadline." The Henderson project hadn't failed. It had been designed to fail by 1,000 small compromises, each one seeming reasonable in isolation, but collectively undermining the integrity of the entire structure. The artifact that crystallized Caleb's realization was his father's old level, which he'd been carrying in his toolbox since clearing out the cabin. The brass instrument was nearly 50 years old, its wooden body worn smooth by decades of use, but it still read true to within a fraction of a degree. Thomas had taught him to use it when he was 12 years old. "A level doesn't lie," his father had said. "It doesn't care about your schedule or your budget or your excuses. It tells you what's true, and you can either listen or pretend it doesn't matter. But if you pretend long enough, eventually the building will tell you the truth in ways you can't ignore." Holding the level now, looking at the engineering reports that documented their construction failures, Caleb understood that he'd been ignoring its lessons for years. He'd been building crooked structures, financially and ethically, accepting compromises that accumulated into catastrophe. "We're going to fix this," he announced to the room. "All of it. We're going to rebuild the foundation correctly, replace the substandard materials, and make this building something we can be proud of." Marcus looked at him as if he'd lost his mind. "Caleb, that will bankrupt us. We can't afford to eat $2 million. We can't afford not to," Caleb replied, thinking about Thomas's sculpture waiting in the underground chamber, about the community workshop plans that represented a different way of thinking about success. This is about more than money. This is about who we are and what we stand for. The next 3 days were a whirlwind of difficult conversations. Insurance negotiations, contractor meetings, client conferences, all conducted with a level of honesty and accountability that felt foreign after years of strategic maneuvering and creative excuse-making. Caleb found himself explaining to clients not just what had gone wrong, but why. Taking responsibility for decisions that had seemed prudent at the time, but had compromised the integrity of their work. It was terrifying and liberating simultaneously. The breakthrough came when Henderson himself, the project's primary investor, asked Caleb directly, "What would you do if this were your own building? Your own money, your own family, who would be working inside it?" The answer came without hesitation. "I'd tear it down and build it right. I'd use the materials and methods I'd recommend to my own father, if he were still alive to ask my advice." Henderson studied Caleb's face, perhaps recognizing something he hadn't seen before. Not the slick confidence of a contractor trying to minimize liability, but the quiet certainty of someone who had remembered what he actually stood for. "Then that's what we'll do," Henderson said finally. "We'll eat the costs together, and we'll build something that will still be standing when our grandchildren are old." That evening, alone in his loft, Caleb called Elena from the treehouse. Through the scratchy connection, he could hear Birch barking in the background and the whisper of wind through pine trees. "I know what I need to do," he told her. "But I'm scared I don't have the courage to do it." Elena's laugh was warm and understanding. "Your father was scared too when he decided to change his life. But he did it anyway, one decision at a time. Fear doesn't disqualify you from doing difficult things. It just means they matter enough to be frightening." The final confrontation came not with angry clients or insurance adjusters, but with Marcus in the quiet of their shared office at 3 a.m. They'd been working 18-hour days to salvage what they could from the Henderson project, and exhaustion had stripped away the professional politeness that usually governed their partnership. "You've changed," Marcus said, not looking up from the revised construction timeline he'd been calculating. Ever since you came back from Montana, it's like you're operating from a completely different playbook. Caleb looked around the office they'd built together, awards on the walls, architectural models of their successful projects, photographs of completed buildings that had made them both wealthy. 5 years ago, this room had represented everything he'd thought he wanted from life. Maybe I have changed, he admitted. Maybe I needed to. Marcus finally looked up, his face showing the strain of managing crisis after crisis. The old Caleb would have found a way to shift liability, minimize our exposure, protect the business. This new version seems determined to take responsibility for everything, even things that aren't entirely our fault. The artifact that lay between them on the conference table was the original Henderson contract, marked with the compromises they'd agreed to in order to win the bid. Lower-grade materials, accelerated timelines, reduced oversight. Each concession had seemed minor at the time, but together they had created the conditions for catastrophic failure. "Look at this," Caleb said, pointing to a clause that allowed them to substitute materials of equivalent quality without client approval. "We used that loophole to save $40,000 on rebar. That rebar is now part of a foundation that's settling because it wasn't strong enough for the load. That's standard industry practice," Marcus protested. "Everyone does it. That doesn't make it right." Caleb thought about Thomas's sculpture, about the careful selection of each piece of wood based on both its structural properties and its emotional significance. "My father taught me that the materials you choose become part of the building's character. Cheap materials make cheap buildings, regardless of what the contract says." Marcus pushed back from the table, frustration evident in every line of his body. "Your father was a small-time contractor who never built anything larger than a barn. This is commercial construction. It's a different world with different rules." The words hung in the air between them, and Caleb felt something fundamental shift in their relationship. For years, he'd accepted that commercial success required moral compromises, that building bigger meant building differently than his father had taught him. "You're right," he said quietly. "It is a different world. The question is whether I want to keep living in it." Over the next hour, they worked out the details of Caleb's departure from the company. Marcus would buy out his partnership stake over 5 years, taking on the debt from the Henderson reconstruction, but keeping the ongoing contracts and established client relationships. It wasn't the clean break either of them would have preferred, but it honored their shared history while acknowledging their divergent futures. "I think you're making a mistake," Marcus said as they finished the paperwork. "You're walking away from 15 years of building this business to chase some romantic notion about mountain craftsmanship. It's not sustainable, Caleb. You can't make a living building one perfect project at a time." Caleb thought about the community workshop plans, about Miguel's description of learning traditional joinery from Thomas, about the curriculum his father had developed to pass on generations of accumulated knowledge. "Maybe the point isn't making a living," he said. "Maybe the point is making a life worth living." 3 days later, Caleb loaded his truck with everything from his loft that couldn't be replaced: his father's tools, his mother's recipe books, photographs from childhood, and the architectural drawings Thomas had created for their never-built future. The expensive furniture, the art collection, the symbols of urban success would stay with the loft's new owner. The drive to Montana felt different this time, not an escape from crisis, but a journey toward purpose. He called Elena from the road to let her know he was coming home, and her delight was audible even through the poor mountain connection. "Birch has been watching the road every morning," she told him. "That dog knows something the rest of us are still figuring out." As the mountains came into view, Caleb felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood: the deep satisfaction of coming home to a place where he belonged, where his work would matter beyond the next quarterly report. The treehouse was waiting, the workshop lumber was seasoned and ready, and somewhere in the forest, an old dog was keeping vigil for his return. For the first time in his adult life, Caleb Thorne was exactly where he was supposed to be, ready to build something that would outlast his own lifetime and honor the legacy his father had so patiently prepared for him to discover. 6 months later, Caleb stood in the doorway of the completed community workshop, watching Miguel teach a group of teenagers the proper way to sharpen a hand plane. The morning light streamed through windows, positioned exactly where Thomas had planned them, illuminating workbenches crafted from the lumber his father had so carefully selected and seasoned. The artifact that captured the transformation was a simple wooden plaque mounted beside the workshop entrance, carved from a piece of the original homestead oak. It bore Thomas Thorne's words, "A man's work outlasts his words, but the greatest work is teaching others to build what you cannot finish alone." The workshop had become everything Thomas had envisioned and more. Local families brought their children on Saturday mornings to learn traditional skills from community elders. High school students earned credit through apprenticeships that connected them to local craftsmen. Even some adults, feeling disconnected from the digital world that dominated their daily lives, came to rediscover the satisfaction of creating something tangible with their hands. Birch, now fully grey but still alert, had appointed himself the workshop's unofficial supervisor. The old dog would make his rounds each morning, checking on different workstations and somehow knowing which young people needed encouragement and which needed gentle correction. His presence created a bridge between Thomas's memory and the living community his vision had helped create. Elena appeared beside Caleb, carrying 2 cups of coffee and wearing the contented expression of someone watching a long-cherished dream become reality. "Your father would be proud," she said. Though they both knew the words were unnecessary, Thomas's presence was woven into every joint and beam of the building, visible in the careful craftsmanship that reflected his standards and values. "I got a letter from Marcus yesterday," Caleb mentioned, accepting the coffee gratefully. "The Henderson project is finally complete. He said it's the finest commercial building they've ever constructed, but it took twice as long and cost 3 times the original budget." Eleanor smiled. "And how does that make you feel?" "Satisfied," Caleb answered honestly. "They did it right, even though it was harder and more expensive. Sometimes the most important buildings are the ones that teach us what we're actually capable of when we refuse to compromise." The community workshop had taught him similar lessons. Building it had required patience he'd never learned in commercial construction, attention to detail that went far beyond contract specifications, and a willingness to solve problems through craftsmanship rather than corner-cutting. But the result was a structure that felt alive, purposeful, connected to both its environment and its community in ways that his Denver projects never had. The afternoon brought a surprise visitor, a young woman named Sarah, perhaps 25, who introduced herself as Thomas's great-niece from the Oregon branch of the family. She'd driven from Portland after receiving a letter Elena had sent to distant relatives, inviting them to see what Thomas had built. "I barely remember Uncle Thomas," she explained as Caleb showed her through the workshop and up to the treehouse. "My grandmother, his sister, always said he was the mysterious mountain man of the family. But this doesn't look like the work of someone running away from people." Standing on the treehouse platform, looking down at the workshop where 3 generations were working together on various projects, Sarah's observation struck at the heart of what Caleb had learned about his father. "He wasn't running away," Caleb said. "He was preparing. Everything he built here was designed to bring people together, to create connections between past and future." That evening, as the workshop emptied and the mountain quiet settled over the valley, Caleb made his way to the underground chamber where Thomas's sculpture waited. The piece had been carefully transported to the town community center, where it now served as the centerpiece of a permanent exhibition about local craftsmanship and community history. But Caleb had kept detailed photographs of every carved figure, and sometimes he came down here to remember the scope of his father's vision. The final artifact of his journey was a letter he'd begun writing to his own future children, not yet born, perhaps not even conceived, but already present in his imagination as inheritors of what he was learning to build. "I want you to know about your grandfather," he'd written. "Not the man I thought he was when I was young and angry, but the man he actually was. Someone who understood that love isn't always expressed in words, that the most important gifts take years to create, and that the work we do with our hands can carry forward things our voices could never say. The letter continued. He taught me that building something meaningful requires different skills than building something profitable. It requires patience, faith in an invisible future, and the willingness to create things you might never see completed. But most importantly, he taught me that the greatest structures are the ones that bring people together rather than setting them apart. As the sun set through the treehouse windows, Birch settled beside Caleb's chair with a satisfied sigh. The old dog had completed his mission, had successfully guided a lost son home to discover what his father had spent decades preparing for him to find. Outside, the sounds of the mountain evening began. Owls calling, wind moving through pine trees. The distant sound of the creek that had provided music for Thomas's work sessions. These were the sounds that had surrounded his father during 20 years of patient building. And they would surround Caleb as he continued the work of creating spaces where community could flourish. Looking around the treehouse one final time before heading down to the workshop for evening cleanup, Caleb felt the deep satisfaction of finally understanding what his father had meant about building things to last. The structures themselves were important, but they were just the beginning. The real legacy was in the connections they fostered, the skills they preserved, and the community they created around the simple act of making something beautiful together. Some fathers leave behind money, others leave wisdom, but Thomas Thorne had left something rarer, a blueprint for how love could be expressed through sustained effort over time, and a son finally ready to follow that blueprint forward into an uncertain but purposeful future.